Every generation has its heroes. Every civilization has its great leaders. But only a handful of people have changed the course of human history forever. More than 2,000 years ago, in a small province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, a child was born whose influence would eventually reach every corner of the world. His teachings inspired billions of people, shaped cultures, influenced art, music, philosophy, and law, and continue to guide countless lives today. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. Yet behind the paintings, traditions, and centuries of history lies a fascinating human story. Who was Jesus? What kind of world did he enter? And why has his life remained one of the most studied and discussed in human history? To understand Jesus, we must first travel back to the world into which he was born. The year was close to the end of the 1st century before the Common Era. The mighty Roman Empire ruled much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its armies were unmatched, its roads connected distant lands, and its influence stretched farther than any empire before it. Yet beneath this appearance of peace and power, many people lived under heavy taxes, strict laws, and foreign rule. One of those places was Judea, a small but deeply significant land along the eastern Mediterranean. For the Jewish people who lived there, this was more than simply a homeland. It was the land of their ancestors, the land of ancient kings, the land where generations had worshipped God and preserved traditions passed down for centuries. Although Rome controlled Judea, the people held tightly to their identity, their faith, and the hope that one day their nation would be restored. Many believed that God would send a promised deliverer, a Messiah, who would bring peace and justice. Exactly what that Messiah would be like was understood differently by different groups. Some imagined a powerful king. Others expected a great spiritual leader. Many simply waited with hope. At that time, Judea was ruled by Herod the Great, a king appointed with Rome's support. Herod was an ambitious builder. He constructed magnificent cities, impressive fortresses, and expanded the great temple in Jerusalem into one of the most remarkable religious buildings of the ancient world. But despite these achievements, many people viewed his reign with suspicion. Historical sources describe him as a ruler who fiercely protected his throne and responded harshly to perceived threats. As a result, fear often lived alongside prosperity. Beyond the cities, daily life was simple. Most families earned their living through farming, fishing, carpentry, or small trades. Villages were modest. Stone homes stood along dusty paths. Children learned family traditions from an early age. Religious festivals brought communities together several times each year, filling Jerusalem with travelers from many regions. Life moved at a slower rhythm than the modern world. Yet uncertainty was never far away. Political tension, economic hardship, and the hope for a better future shaped everyday life. It was into this world, a world filled with expectation, a world longing for peace, that the story of Jesus would begin. But before his public ministry, before the crowds, before the teachings that would echo through history, there was a quiet beginning in a small town that few people could have imagined would one day become known around the world. As the Roman Empire continued to expand, life in the small village of Nazareth remained quiet and simple. Hidden among the rolling hills of Galilee, Nazareth was home to only a few hundred people. Most families lived modestly, working with their hands to earn a living. It was the kind of place where everyone knew one another, and life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Among its residents was a young woman named Mary. According to the New Testament, Mary was engaged to a carpenter named Joseph, a man known for his honesty and devotion to God. They were preparing for a simple life together, unaware that their names would one day become known across the world. The Gospels tell us that Mary received an extraordinary message from the angel Gabriel. She was told that she would give birth to a son who would be called Jesus. For Christians, this announcement is one of the most significant moments in their faith. Historians, meanwhile, recognize it as a central part of the Christian tradition recorded in the Gospels. Around this time, A decree was issued by the Roman authorities requiring many people to travel to their ancestral towns for registration. Joseph's family lineage traced back to King David, whose ancestral town was Bethlehem, about 90 miles south of Nazareth. The journey was long and difficult. Travelers crossed rocky hills, dusty roads, and open countryside. What might seem like a short distance today would have taken several days on foot. Eventually, Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. The town was crowded with visitors, and according to the Gospel accounts, they found no suitable place to stay. Jesus was born there in humble surroundings. The Gospels describe him being placed in a manger, a feeding trough for animals, because ordinary lodging was unavailable. Whether viewed through faith or history, this image has become one of the most recognizable scenes ever recorded. The birth of Jesus is traditionally celebrated around the world as Christmas, although historians note that the exact date of his birth is unknown. Most scholars believe Jesus was born sometime between 6 and 4 BCE, based on historical references connected with the reign of King Herod. This estimate comes from comparing biblical accounts with surviving historical records rather than from a precise birth certificate, which did not exist. The Gospel of Matthew records that visitors known as the Magi, often called the wise men, traveled from the east after observing an unusual star. According to the Gospel narrative, they brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, honoring the child they believed would become a great king. The Gospel of Luke tells another well-known account, describing shepherds in nearby fields who visited the newborn after receiving a message announcing his birth. These narratives have inspired artists, musicians, and writers for nearly 2,000 years and remain among the best-known stories in Christian tradition. Not long after Jesus' birth, the Gospel of Matthew describes growing fear within the court of King Herod. Hearing reports of a child whom some believed would become the king of the Jews, Herod saw the possibility of a future rival. According to the Gospel account, Joseph was warned in a dream to take Mary and the young Jesus to Egypt for safety. The family remained there until after Herod's death before eventually returning to Nazareth. While historians continue to discuss the details of these events, the journey to Egypt has long been remembered within Christian tradition as a story of protection during uncertain times. Little is recorded about Jesus' childhood. The Gospels offer only a few brief glimpses. One account describes him, at about 12 years old, visiting the temple in Jerusalem during the Passover festival. According to the Gospel of Luke, teachers were amazed by his understanding and thoughtful questions. After this moment, the historical record grows remarkably quiet. For nearly 2 decades, Jesus disappears from the written narrative. These years have often been called the hidden years. What was his daily life like? What experiences shaped his character? The historical sources provide very few answers. What they do suggest is that he grew up in Nazareth, lived within a Jewish family, and likely worked alongside Joseph as a carpenter or builder before beginning his public ministry. It was a life that appeared ordinary. Yet within only a few years, this quiet craftsman from a small village would begin a journey that would forever change history. For nearly 30 years, Jesus lived a quiet life in Nazareth. The Gospels tell us very little about this period. There are no accounts of large crowds, public sermons, or extraordinary events. He lived among ordinary people. He worked with his hands. He shared the daily routines of village life. Then, everything changed. Around the age of 30, Jesus left Nazareth and traveled south to the Jordan River. There, a man named John the Baptist had become widely known throughout Judea. John was unlike the religious leaders of his time. He lived a simple life in the wilderness, wearing rough clothing made of camel's hair and surviving on simple food. His message was direct. He called people to turn away from wrongdoing, renew their hearts, and prepare for what he believed was God's coming kingdom. Large crowds gathered to hear him. People traveled from villages and cities across the region. Many entered the waters of the Jordan River as a sign of repentance and a new beginning. John's influence became so great that even political leaders took notice. Yet John insisted that someone greater than himself was still to come. One day, according to the Gospels, Jesus arrived at the Jordan River. he approached John and asked to be baptized. At first, John hesitated. He believed that Jesus should not be baptized by him. But Jesus insisted. As he entered the river, John baptized him. The Gospel accounts describe this moment as the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. For Christians, it marks a deeply significant event in his life. Soon afterward, Jesus withdrew into the wilderness. According to the Gospel narratives, he spent 40 days alone in the desert. It was a time of fasting, prayer, and reflection. The Gospels also describe him being tempted during this period, yet remaining faithful to his mission. After these days in the wilderness, Jesus returned to Galilee. But he was no longer simply the carpenter from Nazareth. He had begun a mission that would soon attract followers from every corner of the region. As Jesus traveled from village to village, his message was remarkably simple, yet deeply powerful. He spoke about love. He taught forgiveness. He encouraged compassion for the poor, the sick, and those who had been rejected by society. Rather than speaking only to religious leaders, he spent time with fishermen, laborers, tax collectors, women, children, and people often overlooked by others. His words reached ordinary people because they were told through simple stories. These stories became known as parables. Instead of long philosophical speeches, Jesus used familiar images: farmers planting seeds, shepherds caring for sheep, families waiting for loved ones, to explain deeper spiritual ideas. People listened because they understood. As his reputation grew, Jesus invited several ordinary men to follow him. Among the first were fishermen working along the Sea of Galilee. The Gospels name Peter, Andrew, James, and John among his earliest disciples. Later, others joined them until there were 12 close followers. They did not come from wealthy families or powerful positions. They were ordinary people who chose to leave their daily work and travel with Jesus. Together, they walked from town to town, listening, learning, and witnessing his teachings. Crowds soon became larger with every journey. Some came out of curiosity. Some hoped to hear words of hope. Others sought healing or guidance. Wherever Jesus traveled, people gathered. His message crossed social boundaries. The poor stood beside the wealthy. Fishermen stood beside scholars. People from different backgrounds found themselves listening to the same teacher. Even those who disagreed with him recognized that something unusual was happening. A quiet carpenter from a small village was becoming one of the most talked about figures in Judea. His words would soon reach thousands, and according to the Gospel accounts, remarkable events would begin to accompany his ministry. As Jesus continued traveling across Galilee and Judea, his reputation spread far beyond the small villages where he first began teaching. People spoke about the young teacher from Nazareth whose words seemed both simple and deeply meaningful. Some walked for hours just to hear him speak. Others brought family members who were sick or suffering, hoping for healing. Before long, large crowds followed him wherever he went. Unlike many teachers of his time, Jesus often spoke outdoors. He taught beside quiet lakes, on gentle hillsides, along dusty roads, and in busy marketplaces. Nature itself became part of his lessons. He pointed to seeds growing in a field, birds flying across the sky, lamps glowing inside homes, and fishermen casting their nets into the sea. These ordinary scenes became powerful illustrations of faith, kindness, humility, and hope. His teachings were easy to understand, yet they invited people to think deeply about how they treated one another. One of his best-known messages became known as the Sermon on the Mount. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gathered a large crowd on a hillside and shared teachings that would influence generations to come. He spoke of mercy instead of revenge, humility instead of pride, peace instead of violence. He encouraged people to love not only their friends, but even their enemies, to forgive those who had hurt them, to care for the poor, to avoid judging others too quickly. Many of these teachings remain among the most widely quoted moral principles in history. Whether viewed through faith or as part of history, their influence can still be seen in cultures around the world today. Jesus often taught through stories known as parables. Rather than giving complicated explanations, he invited listeners to imagine everyday situations. A farmer scattering seeds across a field, a shepherd searching for a lost sheep, a traveler helping an injured stranger. These stories carried lessons about compassion, forgiveness, generosity, and the value of every human life. People from every background could understand them. Children listened beside adults. Fishermen stood beside merchants. Rich and poor heard the same message. Alongside his teachings, the Gospels also describe many accounts of miracles. These include stories of healing people with illnesses, restoring sight to the blind, calming a storm while crossing the Sea of Galilee, feeding thousands with a small amount of food, and even raising the dead. For Christians, these events are understood as signs of Jesus' divine authority. Historians, however, generally recognize these miracle accounts as important parts of the gospel narratives, while acknowledging that supernatural events cannot be verified through historical methods alone. Even so, these stories became central to the rapid spread of Jesus' reputation throughout the region. As his influence grew, so did the number of people who wished to hear him. Villages welcomed him. Families gathered around him. Many believed they had found a teacher unlike any they had known before. But not everyone celebrated his growing popularity. Some religious leaders questioned his teachings. Others worried that his influence challenged long-established traditions. Roman authorities also watched carefully. Large gatherings could sometimes lead to political unrest, and maintaining public order was one of Rome's highest priorities. Although Jesus consistently spoke about the kingdom of God in spiritual terms, the growing crowds surrounding him attracted increasing attention. Still, Jesus continued his journey. He visited towns throughout Galilee. He welcomed those whom society often ignored: tax collectors, people suffering from disease, the poor, the grieving, those who felt forgotten. Again and again, the Gospels describe him offering compassion before judgment and mercy before condemnation. This approach made him deeply loved by many and deeply criticized by others. As months passed, his name spread far beyond Galilee. Travelers carried his story from village to village. Some believed he was a prophet. Some wondered whether he might be the long-awaited Messiah. Others remained uncertain, asking only one question: who was this man from Nazareth? The answer would soon lead him toward Jerusalem, a city filled with hope, celebration, growing tension, and the final chapter of his earthly ministry. As the festival of Passover approached, Jerusalem became more crowded than at any other time of the year. Pilgrims arrived from across Judea and beyond, filling the city's narrow streets with travelers, merchants, and families. The city buzzed with anticipation. Roman soldiers increased their presence, carefully watching over the crowds to prevent unrest. It was into this atmosphere that Jesus made his journey toward Jerusalem. According to the Gospels, many people welcomed him with great joy. They spread cloaks along the road and waved palm branches as he entered the city. For many, this was a moment of hope. Some believed the long-awaited Messiah had finally arrived. Others simply wished to hear the teacher whose words had touched so many lives. During the days that followed, Jesus continued teaching in the temple courts. Large crowds gathered to listen. He spoke about faith, justice, humility, and compassion. But he also challenged hypocrisy and reminded religious leaders that outward appearances meant little without kindness and sincerity. These teachings earned him admiration from many ordinary people. At the same time, they increased tensions with some religious authorities who questioned his growing influence. As Passover drew nearer, Jesus shared what would become one of the most remembered meals in history. Gathering with his 12 disciples, he celebrated the traditional Passover meal. This event is known today as the Last Supper. During the meal, Jesus spoke about love, service, and unity. According to the Gospels, he washed the feet of his disciples, a task normally performed by a servant. It was a powerful lesson in humility. He reminded his followers that true greatness was found not in power, but in serving others. The meal ended with words that Christians continue to remember in religious traditions around the world. Later that evening, Jesus and his disciples walked to the Garden of Gethsemane, located on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Away from the crowds, the garden offered a quiet place for prayer. The Gospels describe Jesus spending time in deep reflection, fully aware that difficult events lay ahead. Meanwhile, his disciples struggled to remain awake after the long day. The silence of the night stood in sharp contrast to the busy streets of Jerusalem. It was a peaceful moment before everything changed. According to the Gospel accounts, a group of guards soon arrived at the garden. Leading them was Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' own disciples. Judas identified Jesus, and he was taken into custody without resistance. Rather than calling for violence, Jesus remained calm. His followers were frightened, and many fled into the darkness. The teacher, who had spent years walking peacefully through towns and villages, now faced arrest. Jesus was brought before religious leaders for questioning. The Gospel narratives describe accusations concerning his teachings and his identity. Later, because Judea was under Roman authority, he was taken before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Historians widely agree that Pontius Pilate served as governor of Judea during this period. The exact details of the legal proceedings are described differently across the Gospel accounts, but there is broad historical agreement that Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion under Pilate's authority. Crucifixion was one of the harshest punishments used by the Roman Empire, often reserved for those accused of serious crimes against Roman rule. According to the Gospels, Jesus was led outside the city walls to a place called Golgotha, often translated as the place of the skull. There, he was crucified. For Christians, this moment stands at the center of their faith. The Gospels describe Jesus responding not with hatred, but with forgiveness, even during his suffering. After several hours, he died. His body was placed in a nearby tomb provided by Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the community. As evening fell over Jerusalem, a deep sense of sorrow settled over his followers. To many, it seemed that the story had come to an unexpected and heartbreaking end. But according to the Christian tradition, it was not the end. It was the beginning of a story that would transform history. For Jesus' followers, the days after his crucifixion were filled with grief, uncertainty, and fear. The teacher they had trusted, the man they had walked beside for years, had been executed by the Roman authorities. Many of his disciples went into hiding, uncertain about what would happen next. To them, it seemed as though everything they had hoped for had come to an end. Yet according to the New Testament, a remarkable chapter was about to begin. The Gospels tell us that on the third day after Jesus' burial, several women traveled to his tomb early in the morning. Among them were Mary Magdalene and other followers who had come to honor him. According to these accounts, they discovered that the stone covering the entrance had been rolled away. The tomb was empty. The Gospels describe them receiving the message that Jesus had risen. For Christians, this event, the resurrection, is the foundation of their faith. Historians generally agree that Jesus' followers sincerely believed they experienced events after his death that convinced them he had risen. While the resurrection itself is a matter of religious belief rather than something historical methods can verify, the rapid growth of the early Christian movement is a well-established historical fact. The New Testament goes on to describe several appearances of Jesus after his crucifixion. His followers reported seeing him in different places and speaking with him again. Some accounts describe him appearing to small groups. Others tell of larger gatherings. These experiences transformed a frightened group of followers into confident messengers who began sharing his teachings far beyond Judea. Only weeks earlier, many had been hiding in fear. Now, they traveled from city to city, speaking openly about Jesus and his message. As the years passed, Christianity began to spread across the Roman Empire. The apostles carried the message into Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, and beyond. One of the most influential figures in this expansion was Paul the Apostle, whose letters became an important part of the New Testament. Despite periods of persecution, Christian communities continued to grow. By the 4th century, Christianity had become one of the major religions of the Roman Empire. Over the centuries that followed, its influence spread across Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually to nearly every part of the world. Today, more than 2 billion people identify as Christians, making Christianity the world's largest religion. But Jesus' influence reaches beyond religion alone. His life has inspired countless works of art, music, literature, architecture, and philosophy. Great cathedrals, paintings by legendary artists, classical music, books, films, and charitable organizations around the world have all drawn inspiration from his teachings. Even many people who do not identify as Christians recognize the lasting impact of his message about compassion, forgiveness, humility, and caring for others. From a historical perspective, Jesus of Nazareth is regarded as one of the most influential individuals who ever lived. Most historians agree that he was a real historical figure who lived in 1st century Judea and was crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Beyond these broadly accepted historical facts, many aspects of his life are understood differently depending on historical scholarship and religious belief. For Christians, he is the Son of God and the Savior. For others, he is remembered as a remarkable teacher, a prophet, or one of history's greatest moral leaders. Whatever one's beliefs, his impact on human civilization is impossible to ignore. Very few people have shaped history so profoundly. More than 2,000 years have passed since a child was born in the small town of Bethlehem. Empires have risen and fallen. Kingdoms have disappeared. Borders have changed. Yet the story of Jesus continues to be told in churches, homes, classrooms, books, documentaries, and conversations across the globe. His life remains a source of faith for billions, a subject of historical study, and one of humanity's most enduring stories. Perhaps that is why people continue to ask the same question that echoed through the streets of Judea so many centuries ago. Who was Jesus? The answer depends on history, on faith, and on the journey each person chooses to take. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to explore more remarkable stories from history, don't forget to subscribe and join us on our next journey through the lives of the people who shaped our world.